Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. I'm Randy Wright, and I'll be your captain on this solo flight special edition of our state-of-the-art radio program. Folks, this will be the final boarding call, so if you please, claim your seats, fasten your seat belts, kick back, relax, and enjoy the show while I go ahead and delve into the pre-flight checklist, as there really is a lot of news and information to get to before I may fully indulge you with your in-flight entertainment. Well, folks, here we are. We're approaching the Christmas holiday, and of course, there are all sorts of strange things that are happening on the geopolitical sphere. Again, it relates a little bit to the president-elect Donald J. Trump and his inability to keep his mouth shut or to at least think before he speaks. That's something that has been a major problem with respect to Trump ever since he managed to win the election. And of course, it's something that cannot be ignored. It's something that has been building for quite some time. And we know that he had issues with China all throughout the primary process and indeed throughout the campaign trail. And one of the things that he did going to social media was to basically throw sand in the eye of the Chinese with this reaching out to Taiwan. Now, the myth that he created was that Taiwan's lady president had telephoned him in order to congratulate him for his quote-unquote unprecedented victory. However, the press release that had been prepared by Taiwan said that he called them. Either way, this led to the Chinese stealing the underwater drone, in which required or actually elicited a response from Trump in which he said that they could go ahead and keep it. They did return it, but this was ratcheting up pressure. And I know that this is something that happened a while ago, and I'm going to tie it into some of the other forms of instability that have come to the forefront in American foreign policy as of late. But the thing that really caught my attention with this was that Michael Savage had put out a letter on his own website in which he said that what Trump was doing was radical, reckless, and dare I say even dangerous. Of course, this is something that we here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, have been warning you, our cherished listening passengers and audience members about for a year and 3+ months now. It's rather shocking, but not shocking at all, that Michael Weiner Savage just now has come to this gross realization. It was there, plain as day, open and obvious for anyone who was looking at this with a modicum of objectivity to see that Trump does not have restraint. And recall that one of the things that we have oftentimes reiterated on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, is that particularly when the executive branch of government has so far distanced and divorced itself from the duties, obligations, and responsibilities laid out for the executive branch in Article 2 of our shared United States Constitution, what we need more than ever is someone who is the quote-unquote leader of the free world, who knows how to exercise executive restraint. Unfortunately, restraint and Donald J. Trump are not two things that go together. They're not peas in a pod. They're not something that it just seems to line up with his characteristic approach to government. And that in and of itself is a problem. Now, where particularly might we say that this problem is threatening to boil over? Why, it will be with our relations with Russia, Turkey, the Middle East, and just our foreign policy stance in general. We saw that rather recently there was that Russian ambassador who was gunned down while in Turkey at an art exhibit in, I believe it was Istanbul. But anyway, he was gunned down by a Turkish nationalist type who was giving his support to ISIS, or the Islamo-Fascist state, basically screaming Allahu Akbar when he went out and fired those shots into the Russian ambassador. And again, what this displays is that there are ancient, and I mean truly ancient, tensions and hatreds as well as animosities that exist in that region. Russia, going back to the time of Constantinople, back when the nation that is now Turkey was the quote-unquote Eastern Roman Empire, they have ties with them. Going all the way back to that. If you look at the Tsarist double-headed eagle that was the symbol of Russia from the 1300s on, it was the original imperial iconography of the quote-unquote Eastern Roman Empire that was the Byzantium Empire or Byzantine Empire. And there was an attempt by the Russians to make Constantinople and all of that Byzantine Empire part of their own. They married into the last empress after the Turks had toppled the Byzantine Empire. They had claimed the title of Tsar, which is the Russian version of Caesar, and all of this was to project this image that they were the up-and-coming new Roman Empire. That's what they wanted to claim for themselves. That was the ideology and the identity that they wanted to claim for themselves. And it ties in to the sort of hatred that has been building and brewing between Russia and the Turks for hundreds of years. Remember that under Tsar Peter the Great, the one that had created the Russian Navy and had sought to modernize the medieval backwater of Eurasia, had sought to get a warm water port in the Russian region on the Black Sea, and not just the Russian, but the Turkish region. And they always wanted to have Constantinople because, due to the fact that they had married into the last vestiges of the Constantinople Byzantine Empire, they saw it as rightfully belonging to them. And so I have a feeling that the anger, the bitterness, the hatred that comes up ties directly into these old things. And it requires a delicate and diplomatic touch, which I am just not seeing being exuded by the president-elect. This is something that could easily spark a war, a major conflict. We already know that Russian imperialism has been on the rise. We know that Vladimir Putin is literally going out there trying to expand his control and his ability to exert Russian influence, dominance, and control over the region and over any of the happenstance that is occurring in the region in order to essentially be the dominant force within not only European politics, but also in that region as well. And those tensions are heightening. These are long drawn out hatreds and animosities that predate the United States, and therefore it requires that we understand the history of it, that we apply the history that exists in that region to fully understand and thereby grapple with the problems that are arising within that region. Now, we all know that this gunman went forth and essentially shot this Russian ambassador in cold blood. And it was Andrei Karlov, who was killed in Ankara. Okay, it was in Ankara, Turkey, on Monday. Just a shocking development. One of those developments that could easily spearhead war or conflict. And again, it shows that these deep-seated hatreds are a part of the fabric and framework of the anger that was felt, is still felt, and won't be resolved by MAGA or any of the other shallow, hollow, empty, and meaningless platitudes that the Trump camp can come up with. These are issues that can only be resolved by being level-headed, by having that understanding of what exists in the region and being able to work through these delicate differences that are a cornerstone of the policies that have been occurring in that region and that have only been exacerbated by Russia flexing her muscles in the Ukraine and in the Crimea in particular, and this notion that they are going to reestablish the Russian Empire. Now, when we look at Russian history, we have to go back over 1,000 years. Russia started off as a Viking dominion. And these Vikings became known by the loose-knit people that were forced into their empire as the Rus. They had their major city in Kiev, and so they were known as the Kievan Rus. And it was Grand Prince Vladimir who was the leader of them until the Mongols, under the grandson of Genghis Khan, basically went in and sacked Kiev and asserted their dominance, demanding payment and tribute from the Russians, and for centuries they dominated them until an upstart city known as Moscow, or the Muscovite country of Muscovy, under the tutelage of Ivan the Terrible, managed to break free from the Russians. Or not the Russians, but the Turks. And then he dominated the Turks, took their land and set his eyes on their port city of Istanbul, what had been Constantinople, and was unable to gain it. It wasn't until Peter the Great in the 1600s to almost 1700s that they managed to build a navy and to get a foothold in the region. But still, they were never able to get that jewel. And so that is a part of Russian pride. That is something that is deeply seated within the Russians, that they are not going to just walk away from this. And I think that they will use this event that occurred on Monday as the perfect opportunity to essentially reach forth and try and proclaim their dominance in this region that they have never fully been able to control. And think about it. Vladimir Putin truly has a working knowledge and understanding of Russia's history. He knows what Russia has sought to dominate over the past successive several centuries, and he is not going to let up on this. This is a perfect opportunity for him to exert the type of control that Russia has wanted since the time of the Tsars or Caesars. And so when people say that he is trying to reestablish the Soviet Union, no. Vladimir Putin is more autocratic than the communist premiers were. Vladimir Putin is essentially looking to assert the type of dominance that Russia had at the height of the Tsars. That is when they controlled 1/6 of the globe's landmass. Stop and think about that for a moment. At its height, Russia's extensive jurisdiction to go from one end of the Russian Empire to the other end of the Russian Empire would have been the same distance between Moscow and Chicago. That is staggering. That is a staggering amount of land to attempt to basically exert hegemonic control over. It is a wide array of people that are not cemented together by faith or language or culture or customs. It was something that was dominated by the Machiavellian approach of fear. Fear and dominance. Is it better for a prince to be loved or feared? That was the question that Niccolo Machiavelli asked. It was the question that he thought was a central paramount question to the proper scope and application of leadership. And when we keep this tangled web of deep-seated history in mind, and we look at some of the graphic things that occurred on Monday, it's that sort of thing that we do have to keep in mind. It's that sort of thing that will dominate the geopolitical idea of what is happening in Russia. And it ties into what I'm about to show, which is exceedingly graphic. So if you have a squeamish stomach or you struggle with these types of images, I would suggest turning away for just this little bit. But I'm going to go ahead and show this clip so that we can then discuss it in greater detail, because I think it's that important to tie it into the overarching history so that we get a better understanding of what is happening in Russia, what has been their dominating modus operandi, and how I think they will respond ultimately to this. So let's go ahead and cue this up now.
Eminim bu serginin sayısı kesinlikle iki.
Çabuk çabuk çabuk. Orada orada.
This is quite a shocking event, especially because it took place at the center of Ankara, just a minute's walk from the US Embassy in Ankara, and just 2 minutes walk to the Turkish Parliament. It's the last thing that would come to your mind, that that's the most secure part of the capital, Ankara, that you could have such a bloody attack.
That tells me that what we're seeing in the heart of Russia right now is something that cannot be ignored. It is clearly a push to say that what is happening in Russia and what is happening in Turkey is directly involved with the Islamo-Fascist state. They are clearly attempting to establish that caliphate that they have been working towards establishing for at least 5 to 6 years now. However, that itself has a history that dates back millennia. And when you're dealing with this sort of deep-seated history, this sort of deep-ranging animosity, it is going to require a delicate touch on the diplomatic front of the United States. Because, first of all, as you heard from that clip itself, they said that it was very, very close to the United States embassy that's located in Ankara, that it was basically a part of all that was going on in the region. And then at the same time that this is occurring, we have that tragic event that occurred in Berlin, where there were those people that were gathering together for the Christmas holiday, that were there to enjoy the festivities of a market at the area, when a truck or bus some large vehicle had plunged through the crowds, deliberately targeting the festivity goers, and basically was yet another attack by those Islamo-Fascist barbarians seeking to target Western civilization. They were going forth to dominate the attributes of our Western culture and civilization, attempting to force us to live in a bastion of fear. They wanted to dominate us with a cloud of fear and uncertainty because they have realized that that is a way in which they can promote their ideology. Now, it's important to recall, once again, looking at history being one of the greatest teachers that mankind has, to realize that we get our term assassin from the Middle East, from Islamic practitioners. It comes from a group of well-trained, fanatical killers that would basically get themselves high on hashish before carrying out these attacks, and they were known as the Assassins, which would later be bastardized to be assassins. That's one of the hallmarks of Islamo-Fascist history that has been handed down to Western civilization and culture. It goes back to the Crusades and before. It was their way of dominating politics through fear, manipulation, and destruction. That is the tenets of tyranny and despotism and totalitarianism that has reigned supreme in that region. And the way that the Russians have always dealt with that is with brute force. So when Vladimir Putin is looking at this as an opportunity to once again basically regain Russian control of what was the Byzantine Empire, this plays out perfectly for his imperialistic goals in endgame. It allows him to sit there and say, look, they targeted us because we're trying to help the Syrian leaders to promote stability in the region, and therefore we must flex our muscles. I honestly believe that that is how the Russians are going to approach this. And it's not unheard of. Think of the time when that Serbian assassin, Gabriel Princip, had assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Habsburg Austrian-Hungarian dynasty at the start of the First World War. It was that brought forth the First World War. Due to the tangled web of alliances, the Western world was plunged into war. Germany against Russia, Austria-Hungary against the Baltic states, England and France against the combined alliances of Germany and Austria-Hungary. These sorts of things are deliberately tied together. They are inexorably linked in a way that cannot be ignored, in a way that has deep-seated connections with animosity, hatred, lack of trust. And I'm afraid that Trump lacks the proper understanding to know how to deal with this. I think he lacks the proper restraint to deal with it properly. And the last thing we need right now is to be flung into an overarching war of that magnitude, particularly when you consider that he's been antagonizing the Chinese as well. It means that the United States of America will be placed into a war that we are ill-equipped and ill-prepared to fight. And that is an exceedingly dangerous position for the United States of America to find herself in. And I don't see this getting better anytime in the foreseeable future. It is something that we must be prepared to deal with that I don't see how we can be. I don't see how we overcome the problems that have been set up here, the sort of danger that has been unleashed here without having some sort of working plan. Maybe we'll have a working plan. I pray we have a working plan if things get out of control, which this is very apt to do. Tensions are high, and, history is on a cyclical pattern, and we are approaching a point in history where we're due to have another mass-scale slaughter like a world war. I certainly hope that doesn't come to the case, and I am certainly not trying to fearmonger here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer. But I am calling things as I see them, and I do see the danger that's here. And if we are not willing to face the fact that there is a major catastrophe looming on the not-so-distant horizon, then we are fools. For lack of a better term, there's no other way to describe it. Meanwhile, as the Islamic fascist state is attempting to work and ratchet this up, we see that there have been red flags everywhere, particularly with respect to the German attack. We know that the Berlin terror suspect, according to Cody Duraspina at Fox, had been on the no-fly list months ago. Now, how is it that these people are constantly on the no-fly list, are constantly being shown to have these ties, to be quote-unquote radicalized, to use the stupid politically correct narrative that has been thrust upon us? How is it that they are always on this list, and yet we never recognize it? We being Western civilization. Well, it's because of the twin cancerous doctrines of political correctness and moral relativism. Now, we here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, have said that part of the reason why Trump managed to dominate in the electoral process was because he positioned himself as being a warrior against those twin cancerous doctrines that are essentially suicidal for Western culture, civilization, and society. But the problem is, if you look back at the way that he treated the new, I believe, Islamic mayor of London, saying that he would let him in after he had said that he would block Islamic immigration and migration into the United States, he's wishy-washy. Again, he embraces this consistent inconsistency that has been a hallmark of his public persona for generation after successive generation, or decade after successive decade, rather, and it's something that cannot be ignored. But German officials on Thursday continued to hunt Anis Amir, who is considered armed and dangerous. A fingerprint in the cab of the truck used in Monday's attack was found on Thursday to belong to Amiri. So already, we see that the ties to Islamo-Fascism come to the surface again. They are attacking Western culture and civilization during one of our most sacred holidays. And this is all designed to try and assert some sort of dominance, a sort of dominance and control over the West, to essentially tell the West that what they are over there with the Islamo-Fascist is superior to us, that they know better than us, that they are stronger than us, and that they will be able to annihilate and obliterate us. Now, folks, the only thing that these small-minded terroristic thugs understand is force, power, and dominance through force. It's all they understand. It is said that Amiri had piqued the interest of U.S. officials after it was discovered he had researched the construction of explosive devices and communicated with ISIS leaders on at least one occasion via the group's Telegram messenger, officials told the New York Times. So again, how is it that with all of this dragnet capability, of which they are telling us to sacrifice our fundamental and inalienable God-given rights against unreasonable searches and seizures, as is guaranteed by the clear and concise language contained in the four corners of our Fourth Amendment, that this slips through their fingers? You see, they want us to give up our rights for something that they don't even use, to protect us, and they all claim it's in the name of national security, yet each and every time they blunder and drop the ball. Therefore, I don't think we should be handing over our rights. I don't think we should be surrendering our rights to the government when the government is not helping us. because it's dangerous. It truly is dangerous. It goes against our national interests. It places us in a precarious position. And unless and until we are willing to address this in meaningful fashion, I don't see how we can overcome it. I honestly don't. And that is something that worries me. It worries me because it tells me that our leaders are not paying attention. They are not paying attention to the dangers that are facing us. And it tells me that the dangers we are facing are far greater than what we previously imagined possible. And therefore, again, it is going to require that we, in our capacity as the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours, come together, standing shoulder to shoulder in solidarity and unity, saying, look, we have to deal with these problems. We have to admit who our enemies are, and we must do so in a way that we aren't sacrificing our fundamental and inalienable rights, which were endowed to us by our Creator, who happens to be none other than the God of nature himself. Now, I know that that is far easier said than done, but it must be done. It is the only way that we can literally vanquish these enemies that are hell-bent on our complete and utter annihilation as a Western culture and civilization. But we see also, while the U.S. moved quickly to keep Amari out of the country, Germany couldn't get him to leave. There were red flags galore, according to this Fox News piece, surrounding the Tanzanian-born Amiri. He, at the age of 24, left Tanzania in 2010 after stealing a truck, a crime for which he was sentenced to prison time in absentia, Die Welt reported. He arrived in Italy but couldn't stay out of trouble, eventually landing in an Italian prison for setting fire to a school at a refugee camp, according to an interview with Amiri's father, broadcast on a Tunisian radio station. News agency ANS reported the fire was part of a revolt against infidels. So already we see that he's basking in the type of language and in the type of ideology that would be deemed, quote-unquote, radicalized. All of this goes against our Western interests. All of this is perpetrated in such a way as to place the United States of America and our Western allies in a precarious position. And again, it is all backed by the twin cancerous doctrines of political correctness and moral relativism. When we cannot say that these ideologies that are practiced by these alleged refugees, whom we are just opening the floodgates to, is detrimental, or dare I even say evil, that leads to these sorts of problems. We know that Amiri applied for asylum in Germany in July of 2015 and was denied in June 2016. However, he was never deported. Why? Is this again due to the touchy-feely sorts of moral relativist drivel and filth that is tantamount to societal suicide that we here in the West seem so willing to commit? I don't know. It certainly feels like it. It certainly feels as though we have placed ourselves in greater danger. And I'm not willing to allow ourselves just to so easily be placed in this kind of danger. I'm not. There can be no question that all that we are facing as a nation and as a people right now can be directly tied into and linked with this sort of danger that is facing us on a day-to-day basis. We know that these nefarious forces that are hell-bent on the complete and utter annihilation of these United States of America, both as a nation and a people, will not rest, at least until they have accomplished their diabolical and twisted goals, which truly have no place in an open, honest, but above all, free society like that of the United States. And we know that by failing to address these problems, it is only going to get worse. But the problem is, we have allowed ourselves to be bamboozled to such a degree that we no longer even realize what we stand for and represent. One of the things that the rank and file of the graduates of Pavlov School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media kept reiterating time and again throughout this disastrous fiasco of the 2016 presidential election cycle was that we have a new alternative or alt-right, what we refer to here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, as the so-called alt-right nationalism. This sort of tribalism that is very similar in nature to the outlook that these Islamo-Fascist barbarians are practicing. Now, what they don't talk about, and what has been ignored over and over again, is this idea that the national identity of these United States of America is clearly delineated and defined in the clear and concise language of our shared United States Constitution. Now, Matthew K. Burke over there at Politistic has put out a piece discussing what Ben Sasse has done to describe what is really our national identity and how our national identity is to be. And he starts the piece with many, if not most Americans don't know this. Thank you, evil Department of Education, because history has been bastardized by leftist historians, what we refer to here at the Wright Flyer as historical revisionists. But the United States of America actually isn't supposed to have a national government, but a federal one. So to all you nationalists out there, regardless of political party, you're wrong. It's the wrong country. And again, it may seem as though what we're doing here is engaging in that sort of dangerous game of semantics, the dark and twisted game of semantics that we here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, have been warning you about since our premiere episode aired back on September 11th of 2015, but it's not. There is significance in the meanings of words. And so it goes to say that the states are the ones who created the federal government in their representative capacity of the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty, we the people. That just speaks volumes as to who we are, both as a nation and as a people. But because our national heritage, character, spirit, and identity have been eroded and have been attacked by the ivory towers of academia from coast to coast and border to border, as well as our information media outlets and sources, as the great visionary Zygmunt Dobbs warned in his magnum opus of Keynes at Harvard, we've lost sight of this. And it was if you recall, the states that enumerated specific powers to the federal government and no more. Think of Article 1, Section 8, the 10th Amendment, and the preamble to the Bill of Rights. Of course, we know that the statists in Washington, D.C. abuse these limitations. They disregard them, they ignore them, they have presented them in such a form and fashion as to even denying their existence. But we know that when you look at the cultural foundation of the United States and the governmental foundation of the United States, we are supposed to be a constitutionally endowed, limited federal representative republic. Now, Ben Sasse spoke to the Federalist Society in this year, 2016, and it was the Barbara K. Olson Memorial Lecture last month. He explained that just because the government should do something doesn't mean it should be done at the federal level in one size fits all. You know, that goes completely contradictory to the clear and concise language that is contained within the four corners of the supreme law of the land, which, pursuant to Article 6, Clause 2, the Supremacy Clause, is none other than the Constitution. And this is how Sasse explained it. He said that federalism that we'd like to see recovered is about depoliticizing the fact that many government decisions that do need to be made by compulsion should be made across 50 laboratories of, he put democracy, I would say republicanism, so it can be closer to the people. so that you can have an experiment with what works and what doesn't work. And again, that ties directly into the notion that the closer that the government gets to the people, where the people have the ability to exert even greater control over the decisions of the government and the direct actions of the government, is where the power should be spread out. That fully explains the foundational image that our founding fathers dreamed of at the conception of our nation some 235 plus years ago. It's one of those things we cannot escape. It's an intrinsic, inherent part of who we are as a nation and as a people. And of course, when you tie it into the sorts of dangers that we're facing, it's why we have the rights. The American people should be entrusted to help defend themselves against the sort of danger and onslaught that is being exposed to us and being fronted against us by nefarious and dastardly elements such as the Islamo-Fascist state, because these organizations are so dedicated to destroying all that we stand for and represent. And it's as my first officer, Jeremy Grapington, has oft-times reiterated on previous episodes of the Wright Flyer, that without our rights, we're left with nothing. Now stop and think about that for a minute, folks. Just how important is that? Why do we spend so much time harping on this fact, this seminal fact that applies to the proper scope and application and exercise of power in these United States of America? We spend so much time focusing on it because that is the deep-seated part of who we are as a nation, as a people, as a government. You see, the government is supposed to work for the people. We delegated certain powers and authorities to the government, and when the government abuses the terms and conditions that are set out in the greatest social compact or contract ever devised by the hands of men, yet divinely inspired by providence above, it is the right of the people to petition their government for a redress of grievances. That's why we see that in the First Amendment. It's also why we have the Second Amendment. That is the inalienable right of the people to defend themselves against not only their government, but any sort of force, whether it be foreign or domestic, that is seeking to strip and deprive them of their fundamental and inalienable God-given rights. That is just tantamount to what it takes for a nation to be free. That is how free and proper government was always intended to work. And I think Ben Sasse was absolutely correct in going forth with this. Sasse went on to say that Nebraska and Vermont have very different people, very different values, very different problems, very different topography. We're going to feed the world and they're going to make some really good ice cream. You see, it speaks again to how government is supposed to work. When government is basically operated from a consolidated, centralized authority by necessity, certain people's wants and interests are going to be swept by the wayside. It is because a centralized authority is ill-equipped to address the individualized and particularized problems that certain segments of society will face. And again, it shows the sagacity and the near infinite wisdom and foresight of our founding fathers to explain that federalism is literally designed in such a way as to limit the power and scope of the federal government. Because when the federal government is allowed carte blanche to operate against the will of the American people, that is when you start to encounter the sorts of problems that we are facing as a nation and as a people. It's because it allows them to operate outside the natural law tenets. And when that occurs, it intrinsically, by its nature, places us in a dark, dank, and dangerous situation, one that we can ill afford to allow to come to the forefront. So again, the onus of responsibility falls squarely on the shoulders of the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty, who happens to be none other than we the people. When you go back to the poetic language that is the opening lines to the preamble to our shared United States Constitution, it states in no uncertain terms and unequivocally that we the people ordain and establish. the Constitution, which is the great contract that defines our government and explains how our government is to exercise and wield power. And that is something that Sass understood. And I love that he said this. And again, I think it's important that we hear it from the lips of the man himself, because I think, again, that speaks intrinsically to what he was saying, but it also allows you to not just take it from us from face value. Because again, it goes directly to the heart of what we are facing as a nation and as a people, and it explains how we are to go about correcting the plethora of problems we face.
Federalism that we'd like to see recovered is about depoliticizing the fact that many governance decisions that do need to be made by compulsion should be made across 50 laboratories of democracy so it can be closer to the people, so that you can have an experiment with what works and what doesn't work. Nebraska and Vermont, we have different people. We have different values. We have different problems. We have very different topography. We're going to feed the world, and they're going to make some really good ice cream. But we shouldn't try. We should, and everybody from Burlington, it's a huge FedSoc chapter. I would love to buy you a steak afterwards. We shouldn't try to solve every problem as the Waters of the U.S. rule does. There are important interstate environmental and water issues that need to be solved in Washington, D.C. But every decision that doesn't have to be solved in Washington, D.C. should be driven back to the states.
So what does that mean? That it needs to be driven back to the states? Well, what that means, without or beyond a shadow of a doubt, is that we follow the 10th Amendment. There is a reason why the 10th Amendment rounds out the Bill of Rights, or the first 10 amendments to our shared United States Constitution. It is because it speaks directly to the sorts of problems that we're facing as a nation and as a people. It allows the particularized needs to be addressed by those branches of government or those elements of government that are closest to the people. And again, that ties directly into the way that our government is designed. Our government is designed in a way to fully empower the American people. It is designed so that we exert the greatest amount of control over the United States people and government. And again, it ties into our entire identity as a nation and as a people. And when we distance ourselves from that and divorce ourselves from that, that is when we continue to encounter these sorts of problems that are detrimental. They are detrimental to such a degree that we lose sight of who we are as a people and as a nation. And I'm sad to see that that is the case. I'm sad to see that we have fallen for the sort of chicanery that will drive us away from what has propelled us to such lofty heights in our relatively brief yet illustrious history here on God's green earth. It means that we have been seduced by victory. We have lost sight of our unifying greater good characteristics. And again, it tells me that there is just a lack of knowledge and understanding. And again, that further explains that why we here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, have gone forth and proclaimed that it is paramount and imperative that we, in our capacity as the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours, foster that fluent and working knowledge and understanding of our shared United States Constitution, and thereby our fundamental and inalienable God-given rights. It has to be. It has to be. Because without that, without that understanding these forces of division, of hatred, of animosity, of identity politics, they can flex their political muscles and they can thrust this nation into this continued division, and a house divided must fall. It cannot stand, it cannot be robust, and it cannot be allowed to come to fruition, because without it, we have no driving force. We have no understanding of who we are, both as a nation and as a people. And I don't think we can afford that. I don't think that we can just ignore this. Because if we ignore it, then the type of chicanery, the type of despotism, the type of totalitarianism that we should seek to avoid at all costs becomes the established new norm in the United States. And I don't want to see that happen to us, just as I'm sure you, our cherished listening passengers and audience members, don't want to see that to happen to this once robust community of popular sovereigns either. So when we face these radical dangers, it's important that we go back to basics, and basics has always been the Constitution. That is what Ben Sasse was speaking to at that Federalist Society meeting. And yes, I don't exactly or completely agree with some of the terminology he was using, but it speaks volumes as to, if you want the United States to be a robust nation, we've got to go back to strict adherence to the clear and concise language contained within the four corners of our shared United States Constitution. It is the only way that we can go about bringing forth practicable and real-world solutions, instead of just complaining about problems and finding solutions that don't work. Because government doesn't work. Our founding fathers fought against a centralized tyranny, a centralized authority of crown and parliament in England, because they were unable to address the problems that were here. And again, the reason that our Constitution is the longest contiguous or uninterrupted running constitutional document in the entire course of human events is because we understood the natural law tenets, because we fully recognized that that is the only way that this nation can be strong and robust. And with that in mind, we recall the multiple times that we came close to losing the fight for independence, the fight for liberty. And it brings up how on Christmas Day, George Washington and his forces crossed the Delaware River to attack a group of German or Hessian mercenaries that were camped in Trenton, New Jersey, and they were willing to risk everything to ensure that the vision of liberty was not lost. That was the first victory that we had in a slew of defeats that really proved to the American people that we could overcome these hurdles, obstacles, and adversities that had been placed in our path, and convinced us that we could achieve victory, that we could secure the blessings of liberty, that we could go forth and create this free, virtuous, and open and honest society that we did. But again, the onus of responsibility falls on the shoulders of we, the people, in our capacity as the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty, to bring this nation back from the brink of ruin and back to a path to prosperity and freedom. Now, with that said, it is time for us to begin our descent. I'm going to go ahead and send the flight attendant back for one last round of alcohol. She's not going to shoot you. She's just going to pour you shots of alcohol. As always, folks, I'm your captain, Randy Wright, and I want to thank you for tuning in to our state-of-the-art radio program. Should you have any questions, comments, concerns, or even topic suggestions, please feel free to leave them either in the comment section here on our YouTube page or on Google Plus or on Facebook. And on top of that, I invite you to follow us on Twitter with the Twitter handle @RadioAviationEX. One more time, folks, that's @RadioAviationEX. And there you will find the departure board that lists my personal Twitter account, the personal Twitter account of my first officer, Jeremy Grapenton, the Blogspot account that is chocked full of useful information, and the Cafe Press account. There are lots of little trinkets and goodies that you can get there for your last minute shopping. It may get there after Christmas, but either way, they'll still appreciate it. You can get it with either our original Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer logo, our First Class Passenger logo, or the two Uplifting America logos, because let's face it, in this time of tumult and turmoil, we could all use a little bit of uplifting. So folks, go ahead and uplift us by taking a gander at that and selecting something that fits your needs and give us a little bit of support, as well as supporting yourself. As always, folks, thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. We'll see you again next time. Please do take care.